Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Supercoach, mates. So this is going to be part 2 of our team reveals, and we're going to go through some teams that you guys have sent in to us through social media. So we're just going to get straight into it. So the first team we're actually going to review is actually going to be the best team of all, which is actually my side at the minute. So I'll quickly talk through it. So structurally, I've actually gone a little bit different to most of the other sides that I've seen around, and one of the key goals that I've had over the off season when I've been sort of flicking through my sides is sort of I've been trying to keep the mid prices sort of out of the top 3 or 4 spots in their lines. So what I mean by that is I've been trying my hardest to keep Elliot Yeo at D4 and Jacob Hopper at M5 and Toby McLean at F5. So they've sort of been the building blocks of how I've sort of built this side. Now, I will put out a disclaimer. I have made a couple of changes since this side got put up on the slides. So I have now got Wits in the ruck. I have now got Rosie in the forward line. And I think I've got Jack Steele in the midfield. So there have been a couple of little changes around, but I guess I'm at the point now where I'm sort of just tinkering around with it. Like I've pretty much got the structure that I want, the setup that I want, and it's now just a matter of fine tuning it, so that when the season starts proper, it's all ready to go. And yeah, so we'll just flick over to the next slide real quick, if I can. So I'll let you do this bit, Jonas, since I can't do my own side.
Yeah. No, overall, some of the picks are very solid. Like the premiums in pretty much every line I agree with. But yeah, the one that's sort of stood out as a bit of a sore thumb was Darcy Cameron in the forward line. Are you by any means concerned? Because I like the Cameron pick as well, but sort of the hamstring injury and then also the fact that Mason Cox has been playing quite well in the preseason really has me concerned about Darcy Cameron's ruck split. Is that something that people should be worried about, or do you think Cameron's still the clear number one option at Collingwood for the ruck?
Well, I think they're actually competing against each other, to be honest. And the reason why I say that is because I think Mason Cox has reinvented himself as a ruckman who can go forward rather than a forward who can go into the ruck, which is exactly the same role that Darcy Cameron has played for Collingwood. So I think with McStay now in the side, and he seems to be a lock given what he did, in that earlier practice match. I doubt Collingwood, with the way they play, will pick both Darcy Cameron and Mason Cox and Myercheck and McStay all in one side. So look, at this current time, as I said, I have moved him on for Rosie. But if Mason Cox is a non-factor, then I think all of a sudden I think he could be back in there. And that's purely because from all reports he's been, other than his hamstring injury, he's been sort of training to go a little bit a Max Gawn sort of role where he sort of pushes back behind the ball, but he can also, because he's been a forward in the past, he's still got that natural forward craft. So the Darcy Cameron situation is a futile one, and it's one that I haven't set on yet whether or not he's actually going to be in the side come round one. But at this stage, I've looked at sides with him and without him, and I seem to end up always going back to him. But yes, I do see Mason Cox as being probably the biggest factor in whether or not Darcy Cameron gets a role in my side, to be honest.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think that's the main indicator as to how good Cameron will score. Could you just go back to your team for a second? Thanks. All right. So can you tell me why you have picked Lockie Neal at M2 instead of, say, a Rory Laird or someone a bit cheaper like a Parrish?
Yeah, so originally I actually had Touk Miller in this position at M2. And again, this is sort of been a bit of a chop and change, this M2 spot. I haven't really settled on anyone as of yet. I think Touk Miller and Lockie Neal, look, I think Miller and Neal will sort of cancel each other out. So obviously you'd save the 15k there, but with Touk Miller sort of being a bit injured throughout the preseason, I haven't settled on Neal yet, but at this stage he's looking like being someone who might be a bit of a point of difference this year. And I have had a look. He's only in about 15% of sides, which is amazing if you consider the fact that he was second in the Brownlow and he started last year about 40k more expensive than what he did this year. So I think people are staying away from Lockie Neal because I think they're worried about what Dunkley might do to him and also because they picked Will Ashcroft in the midfield. But I mean, you've got to remember that I think having Dunkley and Ashcroft actually helps him, especially Dunkley because he's a bigger body in that midfield. And what sides used to do, and I think Melbourne were probably the benchmark of this, was they used to just sit someone on him and just tag him out of the game. But with Dunkley there, with Ashcroft supposedly being as good, if not better, than Nick Dacos and looking like going straight into their midfield, I think they're going to have to divert some attention away from him, and I think he might get loosed up a bit. But yeah, as I said, that M2 spot is very chop and change at the minute, so I haven't really settled on Neal, but he's there for the minute, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then the other player who I have a few issues about, but who could be a really good selection, is Horne-Francis. I feel like he's the sort of player that's not great for Supercoach because he's a purely offensive player. And we've seen in the past some of these offensive midfielders aren't necessarily the greatest Supercoach scorers. E.g. Jordan De Goey last year when he was just purely, he starts in the midfield and then his role is basically either to get the ball or push forward and lose his opposition. And I don't think Horne-Francis at this stage will be able to replicate what De Goey did. So that sort of suggests to me he's not going to average above 90. What do you see Horne-Francis averaging and why is he in your team?
Yeah, so the Horne-Francis pick, he's sort of come on a bit on the later, to be honest with you. So I did have Nathan Fyfe in that role for a lot of the preseason. And then when it came out that he was going to be playing predominantly in the forward line, I had to quickly figure out something to do, and I stumbled upon Horne-Francis. And the reason why I think Horne-Francis, look, he might end up being an M6, but it came out over the summer that he played basically the second half of last year with, I believe it was a back issue. And I think he pretty much fell out of North Melbourne's best side because of his temperament. I think coming from the background that he did, he was very used to winning, and all of a sudden he ended up in a side which wasn't winning, and I think he just fell out of faith. But I think at Port Adelaide, I think the only issue that I have with him is he needs to basically play near full midfield minutes for him to be a worthwhile pick. And I think with the names that are going through there, so Rosie, Butters, Wines, I think Boak might still slot in there a little while. I'm a little bit worried about his viability in my side come round one. And there's a very good chance that he won't be in there. But just the way that it is, because obviously if I don't pick him, then I'm probably going to go all the way down to like a Bruce or an Allen or something, and then I've just got 150k just sitting in the bank, which is just wasted. So I'm glad that this has come out before the practice match or the official practice matches, so I can have a really good look at him and see what his midfield split is. And yeah, if he's up around sort of the 90% CBAs for Port Adelaide, and he's the player that he was in his under 18 year, I think he could be a sneaky chance to really shoot up into sort of maybe not the top, 5, but maybe even the top 8 forward might be good enough for him to be there, just given that the volatility of the forwards this year. So look, he's a bit of a speculative one, but at the moment he is in M4. And yeah, as I said, he might not be there come round one.
Fair enough. Yeah, he certainly has that upside of being a good stepping stone. Is there anything else about this team you'd like to cover?
Look, I guess I'll cover the ruck line. So, obviously, Rowan Marshall's been in my side since pretty much Supercoach opened, and I think our colleague Thomas has been very big on this selection. And I think as long as Ross Lyon plays him as a solo ruck, which unfortunately for those of us who played Supercoach for a long time, we know that Ross Lyon hates Supercoach. As long as Marshall plays that pure ruck role, I think his average will climb up into the Gorns, Grundys of a few years ago. And the Tim English one, I still think Tim English is the best pure ruckman in the AFL at the present time. It's just his body's always a question mark. I think he's really hard to fight for his spot in this side. And Beveridge has been really hard on him. Hasn't basically handed him matches like a lot of other coaches might have. He's really hard to earn his spot in this side, and I think the Bulldogs are going to be a better side this year, given that they've got that key post down there for Norton, sort of the second fiddle for him filled out. And I think as long as English stays fit, I think he can pretty much outrun any ruckman on the ground. So the only problem with English, and it was discussed on the next slide, is if he gets double teamed, what does that do to his scoring? But realistically, I'm not sure if you can really worry about that, because eventually even Marshall, even Goldstein or any of these other rucks, eventually they're going to have to play against this Gawn and Grundy combination. And in some ways, I think I'd rather it out of the way in round 1 as opposed to being, say, round 5. Once the prices start changing, he can have his maybe rougher start. But I had a look through their ruck drawing, and after the Melbourne game, it does sort of open up a bit for the next sort of 4 or 5 weeks. I think his next real tough assignments, Darcy and Jackson, which I think is about round 6, I think it is. So, yeah, I think with the rucks this year, I think you're just going to have a lot of sort of roadblocks, if you will, where you're going to, have, these Gorn and Grundys and, Darcy and Jacksons sort of pop up every, 6, 7 weeks. And I think it's a matter of just trusting your gut and picking the one who you think outside of those matches can do the best. And I think at this stage it'd be either English or Wits. I would say at this stage are probably the ones I'm tossing up between.
Fair enough. Yep.
And I will just quickly touch on. I have been a big fan of Tom Mitchell, but unfortunately, I think given what the news that came out just a couple of days ago about him maybe just focusing more on his contested game, and maybe he's not going to be racking up the ball as much. I think that will affect his scoring a little bit too much. And I think at this stage, I think from what I've heard of Tom Green, he has the capabilities of doing what Tom Mitchell does, but he's younger. I think he's going to have less competition now. I think it's basically going to be Cornelio and that's it, because I think Cully will sort of go out more on the wing. And I think he can really shoot up into that. Maybe a bit like an Andy Brayshaw last year. I don't know if he's going to get to like 125, but Andy Brayshaw averaged 115, and that was enough to get him. I think it was about 9th overall for midfielders last year. So I think that's well within his reach, Tom Green. Whereas I think Tom Mitchell, he might be low hundreds, but I think with that news coming out, I don't think he's going to be pushing that upper echelon of midfielders like I think Tom Green will.
Yep. No, fair enough. Yeah, otherwise a really solid team. I like how you've got a few points of differences as well, just to sort of stand out against the rest of the pack, because there are a lot of teams that have some very similar players, and it's hard to sort of remain unique and get like a bit of an edge at this sort of point of the year.
Yeah, so I will say the disclaimer I will say is that points of difference I find at the start of the year aren't as relevant. I think if you have a point of difference like a massive one, if it goes pear-shaped, you basically screw yourself. But I think as the year comes on, as we get sort of deeper into winter, I think those point of difference players can really help you stand out, especially once, you've seen, price changes and you've sort of got a better idea on their role. But yeah, at the start of the year, I think it's just about trying to pick the players who you trust can get you through those first few weeks scoring wise. And then you can sort of start looking at your points of differences and whatnot throughout the rest of the season.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so that's Nathan's team. And what we'll do now is we'll review some of the viewer submitted teams and go over them. Tom will be joining us shortly for that, and we'll go from there.
So the next team we're going to look at is Rotate's team. So thanks, Rotates, for sending through your side to us on social media. So we're just going to leave this up like we did last time for sort of half a minute to a minute and just get initial thoughts on it. And then we'll flick over to the next screen and we'll sort of go through a bit more of an analysis. But from first glance, there's a few unique picks here that I think will be discussed. But I think the structure looks pretty good from what I can see. Yeah, so we'll move on. So we'll get into the discussion now. So I might throw this one to you, Thomas. You can start off our discussion.
Yeah, so I think this one was one of the stronger teams that we got sent through for two reasons. Because, as I think Nathan might have alluded to in an earlier podcast, I'm not sure if it was a recent one or not, but it might have been even off air, but the whole idea of his magic number stuff, which Nathan clarified in a minute, but essentially this year it almost seems like you can get away with not starting as many of those top price players and get away with getting the next rung down of those premiums and still kind of get away with it with regards to scoring. So if you look at Rotator's team, he's able to get the same amount of potential premiums by going that next rung down with regards to price. So he's got your 4 uber premiums or your top class premiums if you include Cripps and Parrish, which aren't bad picks per se. I mean, there's question marks on Cripps' injury, and then Parrish's tag ability and all that sort of stuff, and Hopper's your M5 for him, which is pretty good. Darcy Marshall, I mean, question marks over Darcy's ruck time moving forward into round 1, but that's solid. And then the 2 ones that I wanted to go into a bit more detail was, his defenders. So he had Ed Richards there, which saved him a bit of cash, which is obviously quite a risky pick, but it could pay off. And Errol Gordon, whom I'm a fan of at the moment, and he's got Zeeble at F4. So the points are there to be taken if they're there. It's just obviously riskier than not starting with those higher end premiums. But I guess Jonas could talk about a bit more of what we didn't like so much about the team. But yeah, I'd say his rookies are pretty good. Jug McPhee's had a good preseason. He's been hyped up a fair bit. Constable looks like he's almost solidified. Hopefully, if the team sheets get named, I think tomorrow for Gold Coast, if he can solidify himself a position in the half back line, then he's a pretty easy pick. But yeah, there's a few expensive rookies. You got McKenzie, Sheasel, and Radaglia. I don't think you could probably start all 3 of them, purely based on utilising it and maybe extra 80k elsewhere by getting rid of 1 or 2 of them. But what are your thoughts, Jonas, on this team?
Yeah, so pretty solid team. The Richards pick looked good in the preseason, but I was having a look, and in the intra-club match, apparently he didn't take many, if any, kickouts. I think he was behind Dale in the pecking order, and Crozier was apparently taking some kick-ins as well. So I would be fading Richards at this stage because he's not going to be getting many points out of that kick-in sort of role. So also, how long's Caleb Daniel going to stay in the midfield? Is it going to be the whole season? I don't think so, which means he's going to come back potentially and take some of Richards' points. So that's a bit of a risk. And also, with the forward line, you've picked my favourite 2 forward premiums in Taranto and Dunkley. However, I think you should probably look at getting 1 more of Rosie or Cornelio, purely because of A, Rosie's price, and B, Cornelio's got a very friendly early fixture. So I'd look at maybe turning Richards somehow into one of those 2 forwards, especially given the fact that some of the rookies in the forward line are a little suspect, especially compared to the rookies on offer in the back line and even in defence. So that's the line I'd be taking. The Zeeble pick is very risky as well. I'm not sure if it's going to be as effective as what it was a few years ago, because new game plan with Clarkson, is he really going to do this chip sort of play? I don't really understand why it existed in the first place, because it wasn't very effective. They were just chipping the ball in defence and going nowhere really. And I think Clarkson's a better coach than to do that. So Zeebel's, plus he's 2 years older and very injury prone, so one I'd be steering clear of. But otherwise, very solid team. I'm curious to see how McKenzie goes this week. And I think Sheasel's actually not a bad pick, because he'll have some good job security and potentially spike a few goals and get a good score. But I would be trying to avoid fielding him week in, week out, because he's bound to score a 30. But yeah, Nathan, anything you'd like to add on to that?
No, I think you guys have pretty much summed up what I was saying. I think the only problem I have with Zeeble, so he's sort of been one a bit like Yo, and he's sort of gone everywhere around the field. So like he's been a defender, he's been played off half back, he's been played. I think he's even been played in the forward pocket. So I think the Zeeble pick is risky in that sense, in that I don't think you could say with any confidence where he's actually going to line up at any particular stage, given that Noble's moved him around. And yeah, just to follow up, I think that a lot of that kick mark stuff that you were talking about, Jonas, I think it sort of started after the West Coast Premiership in 2018. Because that's sort of how they played in that year, the chip mark around the back line. But it didn't work for everyone because they didn't have the kickers that West Coast had. And also they didn't have the spine that West Coast had that year. So yeah, I think sides have moved away from that, a la Geelong. And I think a lot more other sides are going to reap the rewards if they move away from that kick mark to a bit more of a, direct, take the contest on sort of game style. Yeah, I think, but otherwise, yeah, rotates. We all think you've got a really strong side. Yeah, maybe just, yeah, perhaps that Richards one might need to be revisited, which is what we think. But yeah, otherwise, pretty good side. So, yeah, well done there, rotates. And the last team we've got is from Shane. So thank you, Shane, for sending through your side to us. So, again, we're just going to leave this up for sort of half a minute. So, again, I think from what I've seen firsthand, you've got a pretty good structure. I have no doubt there's some picks here that I can see that jump off that might be discussed in the discussion points, which we'll head to now. So I might throw this one to you, Jonas, so you can get us started on our review of Shane's team.
Yeah, it's again a pretty solid team. There's just a few question marks on some of those mid prices like Flanders and Windhager. I don't mind having one of them, but both is a bit, I don't know, I'd be a bit apprehensive about it because Flanders is quite low down in the pecking order with the amount of midfielders that Gold Coast have, and Windhager, I haven't seen enough yet to be convinced that he's going to be a good money maker. So I'd probably keep one of them and then look to either upgrade or downgrade the other. As for which one I prefer, I really do not know at this moment because we haven't seen too much out of them. They've both got some good preseason under their belts, but as far as history goes, it's hard to tell which one's going to be better. I still don't mind the Bose pick, even though he's not playing against Brisbane. Geelong might just be taking a conservative road with that one. And the other question mark I have is over Chad Warner. The midfield you're running seems to be very shallow compared to the general structure that other people have. And so I'd be looking to get maybe one extra premium in because would you be able to flick back to that screen, Nathan?
Yep.
Because looking at that midfield, there aren't too many captain options that stand out. Bontempelli, of course, is an uber premium, but apart from that, I'm not too sold on Cripps or Tom Green being strong captaincy options. So maybe having one more 600k mid, and you do have 50,000 in the bank, might go a long way in making sure you get some solid points. So, for instance, you got 50k in the bank. I'd look at doing some rejigging with potentially Young, and potentially Chad Warner, and also one of Flanders and Windhager. But otherwise, a very solid team. The forward line's good. You got most of the good rookies. I'm not sure on who that D McDonald is in the forward line, but I assume just a placeholder at this stage. But yeah, I think overall, very solid team.
Have you got anything to add, Thomas?
Yeah, it's as I mentioned those notes there. The midfield, I think, is probably one short of what everyone else has at the moment with regards to premiums that are worthwhile of keeping. Yeah, having Green and Warner in the side both is a bit risky. Whilst Green, had I think a 50 disposal or something stupid in the intra club, he was playing intra club, which means he was playing against a B side pretty much. We don't know how we'll go round one against a full stat midfield. It's hard to say. Warner, on the other hand, obviously we didn't see much of him in the pracky stuff, and intel in general with him is pretty vague with regards to how this midfield is going to look with Sydney. If Goulding is given a more of a run in the middle, or as soon as round one hits, it'll pretty much be Parker, Warner, and Mills in a sense. I mean, Rowbottom's also there as almost a permanent mid now, so he's one that you want to keep an eye on. Windhager, I'm pretty sure I'm going to go to the game on Friday myself against Essendon in that pracky game, so I'll see him firsthand how he goes. But from what I understand is when he got put in the middle towards, I think it was the back or second-ish kind of half of that practice game against Melbourne, he stood out as an impressive unit and really was quite impressive in understuff. I don't know if that translates well to Supercoach scoring, but it's one to watch, I guess. But as Jonas said, having him in Flanders, I think, is quite risky because Flanders didn't have any mid minutes in his pracky game, and I think he's one that could just get good scores off goals rather than disposals. I mean, he did seem to float a bit high half forward-ish, but he's one that's quite risky. Obviously, Jack Bowes, he's one that is a bit of an unfortunate situation because I think everyone had him and then had to essentially get rid of him, I think, because he wasn't picked by Chris Scott. I don't know why. If there's an injury going on. Yeah, so I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing. It's hard to say. And I think you just have to stay away from those players that don't play those both matches because you can't see them properly. You always have essentially the first two rounds to make that correctional trade if you need to. So it's one of those things where you just have to be a little bit careful if you still want to pick him. Caulfield is one that I'm not sure about. I think for myself as a St Kilda supporter, I know I haven't mentioned it there, but he's one that he looked good when he was on, but he kind of shied away from some packs and things like that. So it almost seems like they're easing him into the season. Coming back from an ACL is a pretty big thing to come back from, and he's one that I think could suffer a little bit scoring wise because he's just not getting near the ball round one or so. But yeah, other than that, it's a pretty solid team most of the way through. Obviously, it's really good that you've got the 4 premium forwards, which is kind of what everyone's trying to aim for whilst not jeopardising the rest of your side. But I think ideally you'd want one more midfielder in there, to really strengthen it, or maybe not one more midfielder altogether, but just upgrading maybe one of Warner and Green just to solidify your forward line, even your defence. You could, hypothetically speaking, wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe chuck one more in if you can get up from Bowes. But any last thoughts with regards to that, Nathan?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm just having a look now, and he hasn't got Fergus Green from Hawthorn, so not sure what his scoring's going to be like, but at 123k, I think I'd rather have him over one of Bowes Flanders or Windhager. So the fact you've got 48k in the bank means that if you get rid of one of those two, Windhager or Flanders, down to Fergus Green, that's going to get you another 140k, which will then allow you to basically upgrade one of Warner or Green to anyone other than Oliver or Roy Laird. So I think that's probably a pretty logical decision. Well, at least that's what we all think anyway. But yeah, I think otherwise, other than that, I think it's a good side. So just one last thing, just before I wrap up. I might throw this to you, this one, Jonas. Any players that you're going to be sort of keeping your eye on over the practice matches this weekend?
Yeah, there's a fair few. Literally half of GWS and Western Bulldogs' team But
Yeah, well, they haven't played yet,
outside
have
of
they?
that, yeah, outside of that, I would be curious to see how many CBAs Goulden attends in comparison to someone like Rosie. Otherwise, some of the mid prices again, like you're not going to be able to see Bose, but perhaps Tanner Bruin and perhaps even Yo, and Yo's pretty much a lock, but Sheed and some of the Collingwood players, like I want to see how Dacos goes this week, and I'm also curious on Doherty to see how much mid time he gets. But yeah, in every game there'll be a few players, even some of the premiums. When you're tossing up between two, sometimes you need that preseason game just to act as a bit of a differentiator or convince you to go one way rather than another. But is anyone there I've missed, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, we were going to make a post about this on Twitter, probably tomorrow, about who to watch or who we think are the main guys to watch out for. But I mean, pretty much you rolled most of them off. Yeah, Callahan's a one that will be interesting for the Giants to see whether he can continue playing that mid role. He was quite impressive apparently in the Pracker game, and he's an option at that 240k mark. Yeah, obviously some of the rookies that you mentioned. Interesting to see what the Hawks will do with Cam McKenzie and Green, obviously replacing Lewis a little bit. But McKenzie's the one that was quite popular. Whether or not he'll keep that mid rotation. Obviously, Will Day is another one that is a 300k option that played a lot of midfield time in the Pracker game against the Cats. So whether he stays that way, he could even be an upgrade from Bowers if you're wanting to keep that kind of structure in your team. The big one I'm looking at, obviously, with Rucks being a disaster at the moment, with not having a kind of clear standout, is if Lysette dominates in the ruck. Against Freo, he has a tough gig against Sean Darcy, so that's as best as a kind of indicator that you'll see if Lysette's ready to go. And the last thing I'll just say before we wrap up is, yeah, the rotation between Rosie Buddies and Horn Francis, I think it's a big one. On the team list,
it affects me as well.
Yeah, as we talked with Nathan's team earlier, I wasn't there for the first bit, but he's obviously got Horn Francis in his side. So whether or not he is a main contributor in that midfield, or if he stays in that midfield, will be an interesting one, or if it's kind of just a 30% split between all three of them. But I can only see if Horn Francis is listed as a midfielder, like a follower on baller. He could probably negatively impact Rosie and Butters a fair bit just because of the rotational aspect. Whereas last year, obviously Butters was hampered by injury and Rosie played predominantly midfield the whole time. I think they listed Lysette, Wines, and Horn Francis as starting three. Whether or not they start that or they want to implement other avenues to their midfield and other weapons to their bow with adding Butters and Rosie, but I could only see it as more of a rotational basis than anything. So, yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see. But and that's all we got time for today. We kept it a bit short. I mean, we didn't want to keep it going on and on with team reviews. I guess they're quite similar. We obviously have a few, exciting times ahead with a few more videos lined up with regards to the Pracky games and leading up to round one. And it's good to see our socials are humming nice along, which is nice, and we'll try to constantly update it on the socials, in particular Twitter is our main one. But for now, we'll catch you for the next one.